The pen was already touching the paper when the cleaning cart wheels squeaked against the marble floor, and nobody in that boardroom even looked up. Vivienne Cross had been CFO of Alderton Capital for 11 years before she became CEO, and in all that time, she had never once signed a document she didn't fully understand. Until that Tuesday morning in March, when the numbers on the bankruptcy filing blurred slightly at the edges, and she told herself it was the lighting. It wasn't the lighting. The conference room on the 42nd floor of the Alderton Tower looked out over downtown Chicago in every direction. On a clear day, you could see the curve of Lake Michigan to the east, a thin silver line between the city and the sky. It was not a clear day. The clouds sat low and dense, and the light inside the room had that flat institutional quality that makes everything feel slightly unreal, slightly like a dream you can't shake after waking. There were 7 people at the table, Vivienne at the head, her general counsel, Marcus Webb, to her left, with a stack of folders he kept adjusting by fractions of an inch. Across from him, 2 representatives from Hargrove Debt Solutions, a firm that specialized in what they called corporate restructuring, which was the industry's polite term for picking through the bones. Beside them sat Alderton's head of compliance, a woman named Claudette, who had stopped making eye contact with Vivienne sometime around 40 minutes ago. And at the far end, barely visible behind a laptop screen, was Derek Sloan, the man the board had brought in 6 weeks ago as an independent financial advisor, which was also a polite term, this one for the person the investors sent to watch you fail in real time. The 8th person in the room was not at the table. He was in the far corner, near the windows that faced north, moving a mop in slow, methodical arcs across a section of floor that was already clean. His name badge said T. Morrow. He was wearing the gray uniform of Summit Facility Services, the contracting company that handled the building's custodial work. He had a face that people forgot while they were still looking at it, the kind of ordinary that made you feel he must have been there for a while because you had no memory of him arriving. Vivienne did not look at him. Nobody did. Miss Cross. Marcus pushed the top folder 2 inches closer to her hand. The filing window closes at noon. If we're going to do this, we need to do it now. Vivienne looked at the folder. Alderton Capital had managed institutional assets for 31 years. Her predecessor had built it from a 2-room office in Wicker Park into a firm that at its peak held nearly $4 billion under management. She had spent 7 years as his CFO, learning every system, every protocol, every redundancy the firm had built into itself to prevent exactly this kind of catastrophic loss. And then she had spent 4 more years as CEO watching those systems fail one by one as the operating capital bled out in ways that the quarterly reports showed clearly but explained poorly. $1.5 billion gone. Not in a market collapse, not in a fraud scheme anyone had detected, not in a series of bad bets that could be pointed to and named. Just gone slowly through a pattern of outflows that the internal audits had flagged as unusual and then classified as reconciled and then never mentioned again. The Hargrove representatives were watching her with the careful, patient expressions of people who were billing by the hour. "Mrs. Cross," Marcus said again. She picked up the pen. The cleaning cart wheel squeaked once more, and then there was a sound she couldn't immediately place, a slow, careful the kind a person makes when they've been holding something in and have decided to let it go. "Excuse me," the voice came from the corner. Low, careful, with the slight roughness of someone who didn't often speak in rooms like this one. Marcus turned first, then Claudette. Then the Hargrove representatives, who turned together like they were on a single hinge. The man in the gray uniform had stopped mopping. He was looking at the projection screen on the south wall, where the operational ledger had been displayed since the beginning of the meeting. A dense grid of figures showing Alderton's expense flows for the previous fiscal year. Someone had left it up and nobody had thought to close it, because nobody in the room had considered that it mattered who could see it. "I'm sorry," the man said. He wasn't looking at anyone at the table. He was still looking at the screen. There's a number up there that doesn't add up." The silence that followed was the particular kind that happens when something unexpected, occurs in a room full of people who are absolutely certain they know how the next hour is supposed to go. Derek Sloan looked up from his laptop for the first time all morning. Marcus said, "This is a private meeting." He said it the way people say things when they want a situation to dissolve without requiring any further effort from them. The man in gray nodded once, the way someone nods when they've heard something and disagree with it, but don't want to argue about the disagreement. "I know. I'm sorry. I'll be out of your way in a second." He pointed at the screen, not gesturing vaguely but pointing precisely at a specific column in the third section of the ledger. That reconciliation figure, in the Facilities and Infrastructure column. It's off by a factor of 10. Vivienne did not put the pen down, but she didn't move it either. "Sir." Marcus's voice had acquired the careful, controlled quality of someone choosing words the way you choose footing on ice. "This is a confidential corporate proceeding. I'm going to need you to. It says $43 million in annual facilities overhead." The man in gray said it quietly, without heat, the way you state a fact you've checked more than once. "For a firm this size, in this building, with your square footage, that number should be closer to 4 million. 4.2, maybe 4.5 if you're running premium contracts. 43 million is 10 times what you should be paying. That's not a rounding error. That's not inflation. He stopped, glanced at Vivienne for the first time. "That's something else." The room was very quiet. Vivienne Cross had not gotten to where she was by ignoring things that made her stomach drop. She had spent 7 years tracking numbers that didn't reconcile, pushing back on figures that didn't feel right, earning a reputation in the industry for being, as one profile had called her, constitutionally incapable of letting something go. She had let the facilities line go. Every quarter for 3 years, she had looked at that column and felt a faint, low-grade unease and then moved on because the internal audits had stamped it reconciled, and she had other fires. She looked at the screen. "Get me the original facilities contracts," she said. "All of them. Going back to 2021. Marcus blinked. "The filing window. Get me the contracts, Marcus." The man in gray picked up the handle of his mop. He did it without drama, without waiting to see what happened next, the way people do when they've said what they needed to say, and don't require acknowledgement for having said it. He maneuvered the cart toward the door. "Wait," Vivienne said. He stopped. "What's your name?" He looked at her for a moment. He had dark eyes and the kind of tiredness in his face that isn't from one bad night but from a longer accumulation of things. The tiredness of someone who has been managing something heavy for a long time without putting it down. "Thomas," he said. "Thomas Morrow. Mr. Morrow." She held his gaze. "What do you know about facilities, cost structures?" Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. More like a door opening a crack. "I used to work in municipal contract auditing," he said, "for the city of Chicago. 11 years. I audited infrastructure spend for the public school system, the Parks Department, the City Facilities Maintenance Division." He paused. "I know what things cost. The contracts took 40 minutes to locate. In that 40 minutes, the Hargrove representatives excused themselves to make phone calls, Derek Sloan's laptop screen stayed dark, and Marcus Webb reorganized his folders several times without appearing to accomplish anything. Thomas Morrow sat at the far end of the conference table with a paper cup of coffee that Claudette had brought him without being asked. He didn't say anything. He didn't fill the silence with explanations or context. He drank his coffee and waited, the way someone waits who has learned that patience is not passive but active, a form of discipline that takes practice. When the contracts arrived, printed and stacked, Vivienne laid them across the table and stood over them. She had her reading glasses on now, the CFO's posture, slightly forward, completely still, the way a predator looks when it has finally locked on to something real. It took her 9 minutes. The facilities contracts for Alderton Capital had been renewed in 2021 through a vendor called Paragon Infrastructure Services. Paragon had submitted the lowest bid in a 3-vendor process and been awarded the contract by a facilities subcommittee whose records showed 3 members, 2 of whom Vivienne had never heard of. The annual contract value was $4.1 million, which was correct, which was reasonable, which matched every comparable firm of Alderton's size in the Chicago market. But there was an addendum. On page 44 of the contract, attached as Exhibit G, was a supplemental maintenance and systems integration agreement. A 6-page document dense with technical language about HVAC, calibration, and network infrastructure, monitoring, and building systems redundancy protocols. The supplemental agreement added $38.9 million annually to the contract value. It had been signed by a name Vivienne didn't recognize with a title that read Deputy Director of Operational Infrastructure, a title that did not appear anywhere in Alderton's organizational chart, then or now. She sat down slowly. "Marcus," she said, "who authorized the creation of a Deputy Director of Operational Infrastructure position in 2021? Marcus said nothing. "Marcus, I don't know," he said. He said it to the table. Vivienne looked at the signature on page 44 for a long time. Then she looked at Thomas Morrow. "This addendum," she said. "How did you know to look for something like this?" He set down his paper cup. "I didn't," he said. "I just saw the total figure on the screen and knew it was wrong. The rest," he gestured at the contracts with one hand. "The rest is what usually happens when you follow a number that doesn't make sense. It leads somewhere." "In your experience with the city audits," she said, "when you found something like this, what was usually behind it?" He looked at her steadily. Someone who thought they'd made it complicated enough that nobody would look. The noon filing deadline passed uncrossed. Vivienne called the board at 12:08 and told them to hold. She called in Alderton's external auditors at 12:45 and told them specifically what to look for. By 2 p.m., she had a forensic accounting firm on a plane from New York. What they found over the following 10 days was both simpler and more terrible than the elaborate fraud that some people expected. Paragon Infrastructure Services was a real company that provided real services at the real price of $4.1 million per year. The supplemental agreement in Exhibit G, however, directed payments to a separately structured subsidiary of Paragon, a company registered in Delaware with a single beneficial owner whose name, filtered through 2 layers of holding companies, eventually resolved to someone Vivienne had trusted for a very long time. The name on the filing was not Marcus Webb. It was the name of Vivienne's predecessor, the man who had built Alderton Capital, the man she had worked for, learned from, and defended publicly for 11 years after his retirement. He had structured the supplemental agreement in the final months of his tenure, drawing from the firm's operational reserves, and had continued to draw from it through a mechanism so embedded in the firm's back-end accounting systems that it had survived 3 separate internal audits, 2 external reviews, and 1 SEC inquiry without surfacing. $42.3 million annually for 3 years and 4 months. $141 million in total. Not $1.5 billion. The bankruptcy filing had been calculated on figures that included the legitimate operational losses from the pandemic years, the market correction, and a failed acquisition in 2022. The actual total under management, once the misdirected funds were removed from the liability calculation, was recoverable. Not comfortable, not easy, but recoverable. Vivienne sat in her office on the 42nd floor at 11 o'clock at night, 11 days after the deadline she hadn't crossed, and looked at the city lights below her and felt something she couldn't immediately name. Not relief, exactly, not victory. Something quieter and more complicated than either of those. She thought about the pen touching the paper. She thought about the squeak of a cartwheel. She found Thomas Morrow on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks later, cleaning the elevator bank on the 38th floor. She had asked the facilities coordinator which floors he was usually assigned to, and the facilities coordinator had looked at her with the expression people wear when the CEO asks them something unexpectedly specific. He was moving a cloth across the brushed steel panel when she stepped off the elevator and said his name. He turned, looked at her. His expression was the same as before, careful, unhurried, not performing anything. "Miss Cross," he said. "I wanted to find you," she said. "I realized I never." She paused. She had rehearsed this slightly and was now aware that the rehearsed version sounded wrong. "I never properly followed up. After the meeting, You didn't need to, he said. I know I didn't need to. She looked at him directly. How old is your daughter? Something moved in his face. How do you know I have a daughter? The facilities coordinator mentioned you'd asked about the hospital liaison program for employee family members. She kept her voice even. I looked into what that was. It's a benefit that helps with scheduling flexibility for employees with family members in long-term medical care. He was quiet for a moment. Then, she's 7. Vivienne nodded. She did not say she was sorry, because he hadn't told her anything yet and she didn't want to assume. What's her name? Mackie, he said. She has a condition called Fanconi anemia. It's a bone marrow disorder. She's been on a treatment protocol for about 14 months. He said it flatly, not for sympathy, but the way you say something you've said many times and have found that the flat version is easier to carry. She's doing okay right now. The protocol is working, but it's week by week. Vivienne looked at him for a moment. She thought about 11 years in municipal auditing, the kind of precision that work required, the kind of mind. She thought about the salary that Summit Facility Services paid, and she knew what it was, approximately, because she had looked that up too, Mr. Morrow, she said, I'd like to offer you a position. He blinked. It was the first time she'd seen anything like surprise on his face. Not as a gesture, she said quickly. I want to be clear about that. Alderton is in the process of rebuilding its internal compliance and audit function. We have significant gaps, which is, among other things, how we ended up in the situation we were in. I need people who can read a financial document the way you read that ledger. People who see what's wrong before they understand why it's wrong. She paused. That's not a common skill. It's actually a very rare one. Thomas Morrow looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the cloth in his hand. I don't have a finance degree, he said. You have 11 years of municipal infrastructure auditing, and you caught something in 45 seconds that 3 external reviews missed in 3 years, she said. I'm less interested in the degree. He was quiet again. The elevator bank hummed softly. Somewhere on a floor below them, a phone rang and stopped. The hospital program, he said. The scheduling flexibility. That would continue, she said. And the health coverage through Alderton's plan is substantially better than what Summit provides. I've had HR prepare a comparison if you'd like to see it. He looked at the elevator panel. He looked at the cloth. He set the cloth down on top of the cleaning cart with the same deliberate, unhurried care he seemed to bring to everything he did. Okay, he said. The man who had built Alderton Capital, whose name Vivienne still could not bring herself to say aloud, in that first month, without feeling the specific ache of a particular kind of betrayal, was indicted in May on charges of wire fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and a set of financial crimes that the federal prosecutor described at the press conference as sustained and deliberate. His attorney said his client would contest every charge. The proceedings would take years. Vivienne did not attend the press conference. She was in a meeting. The meeting was in the same conference room on the 42nd floor. Same table, same view of the city, same flat spring light coming through the tall windows. But the projection screen showed something different now. A restructured operational framework for Alderton's compliance division, built around a new internal audit protocol that Thomas Morrow had spent 6 weeks designing with a team of 3, 2 of whom had come from the city's Inspector General's office and shared his particular talent for finding the number that was wrong before knowing why it was wrong. He sat at the table now, not at the far end, closer to the middle. He had the same face, the same measured quality of attention. He was wearing a suit that didn't quite fit yet in the way new suits don't fit yet, slightly formal, slightly borrowed feeling, and he had a notepad in front of him with handwriting on it in small, even columns. Vivienne looked around the table at the faces she had assembled. The ones she had kept, the ones she had brought in, the ones she had found in the corner of a room where he'd been invisible because no one had thought to look. She thought about all the things that don't get found because the people who would have found them are doing something else instead. Cleaning floors, driving buses, stocking shelves, carrying precision and insight and hard-won knowledge through spaces where the people at the tables don't think to ask. She thought about a pen and paper and a wheel that squeaked at exactly the right moment. "All right," she said. She opened the folder in front of her. "Let's start from the beginning.